Today, we're being joined by Professor Kevin Jones. He is the head of the Cyber Ship Lab at the University of Plymouth. Thanks for taking the time, Professor, to be with us today to talk about what I think is an extremely important topic when it comes to the maritime industry.
Happy to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. One of the questions I have, we've seen the regulatory landscape over the past couple of years changing and actually improving with the implementation now of the IMO 2020 regulations. We have additional regulations that have been put in place by the U.S. Coast Guard in the United States, and most likely more to come. What do you see in the maritime industry as kind of the major vulnerabilities when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think there are answers to that at a number of different levels, to be honest. I mean, the first big problem the industry has is awareness. There are still a lot of people that think even the kind of regulations you've talked about are kind of unnecessary because the industry doesn't have a problem with cybersecurity. There's provable evidence that that's no longer true. It might have been true a while ago, but it's not now. But I think until the sector catches on to the idea that actually this is a life problem that needs appropriate attention, there's going to be, I suppose you could call it a follower mentality, in that people are not proactive about solving the problems before they happen. So I think what we're seeing is that the leading edge companies are beginning to do something. Trailing companies are perhaps doing the minimum to comply with regulation, maybe not yet taking it quite as seriously as they should. And so we're going to see a gradual increase in awareness, and hopefully not dramatically changed by a dramatic incident, which would make people suddenly realize, oh, we've got to take this seriously. So I think what we're seeing is a trend in the industry moving from obliviousness to awareness and eventually into proactive responses. But that's quite a way off in the future, I'm afraid.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because when we look at the global supply chain, 90+% of the goods that we use are transported at some part in their life by ships. So an attack on the infrastructure, i.e. ships or the fleet management or actual companies, could be pretty devastating to the global economy. As we look at the attack landscape, Professor, how has it really changed in the types of attacks that we saw maybe 5-6 years ago to what we've seen today?
Going back 5 or 6 years, there were only really two kinds of attack on the sector. One, accidental, the script kiddies or someone at that level of sophistication accidentally finding a ship, or more likely, traditional IT level malware attacks hitting portside infrastructure and office-based infrastructure. There was very little targeted attacks on the maritime sector. If there were, they tended to be things like nation-state level attacks with large-scale GPS spoofing to investigate probably their capability for doing that. So there was almost nothing in the middle, which is where the bulk of activity normally happens in cyber incidents. I think that's changed. So we've now moved into an era where it has become clear there's money to be made by cyber attacks in the maritime sector, whether that's ransomware, whether that's sort of influence on ship routing, influence on cargo delivery. Those things are now becoming a profitable mechanism that can be exploited by organizations up to the level of, worldwide organized crime. That's different. That means you are no longer only vulnerable if you are a nation state target or if you are completely open so that people can accidentally drop malware on you as they sort of wander by. There are now, I suppose you could call them business models, where organized crime have mechanisms, both in technical capability and more importantly in the monetization, that makes the sector an attractive target. Most of the major shipping lines have been hit to some level or another in the last couple of years. That definitely wasn't true 5 or 6 years ago. So that change has happened in the same way that if you look at the banking sector 2 decades ago, they went from we don't have to worry about it to we are a prime target. Other parts of both critical infrastructure and industry, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, I think the maritime sector is actually catching up. they are now a juicy target for certain kinds of criminal activity.
If we look at now that kind of change in tactic and targeting and looking at the potential of the maritime industry, I think to be, like you said, a pretty juicy target. Do you feel that the current, the regulatory frameworks that we have in place are appropriately addressing the cyber threats, or do you think there's more that needs to be done on the regulatory side?
Well, firstly, let me say I think it's good that something is being done.
Right.
Because something is always better than nothing. And the fact that the IMO now have a regulatory framework that requires cyber risk to be considered is clearly a positive step forward. Mm-hmm. However, if you really look at the sort of the meat of that regulation, it just says cyber risk has to be considered. It doesn't really say you have to be able to do anything about it or really fully understand the nuances of your consideration. I'm being slightly cynical there because, of right. course, proper organizations will take that seriously and do a full risk assessment. But you could comply with regulation by saying, we've considered cyber risk, let's move on, which doesn't really do much to change the overall profile of the industry. So I think it's good that that's there. I don't think it's enough. There are organizations, as I believe you mentioned, like the US Coast Guard, who are trying to take that to the next level. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about what meaningful response, even at the level of risk assessment, is within the industry. So there's probably a lot of work to do to get that balance right. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are two extreme points. There's the cyber risk, who cares? Not a good idea. There's the, oh my goodness, the sky is falling, everybody has to have armed guards and sort of, botnets on their own ships. Unreasonable. There's a sweet spot in the middle where, depending on who you are, what you carry, where you go, what equipment you have, the appropriate level of risk assessment and risk mitigation in a cost-effective way makes sense. That's something the industry is not really ready to do yet, and is certainly something that the regulatory authorities are not able to enable because they also don't know what that would look like. So the two concerns from someone like myself who looks at this in detail are somebody says, too hard, let's not do anything. Then something really bad happens and there's a knee-jerk response of let's go too far and effectively make global trade uneconomic. So it's finding that middle ground and finding it in an industry that is inherently worldwide. So, the US could decide independently that this is what we require to enter US ports. The UK could say, here's what we require to carry a British flag. But then a lot of companies will say, right then, well, we won't do that. We'll go to a South American port or we'll, carry a Jamaican flag or something. So it's getting the balance right so people understand the regulation is there to increase security and hence increase profitability, even though there might be some cost associated with it. So I think there's an interesting body of work to do to get that right. Part of it is the regulators, part of it is the cybersecurity part of the industry, part is the operating part of the industry. So it is a global problem in a very literal sense.
So now I'm going to ask you to take a look in your kind of proverbial crystal ball as where we sit today. And we've gone, as you said, basically from oblivion, we don't care about cyber, to now we're getting to awareness, to hopefully in the future being able to get to a place where we're really starting to, as an industry, take a look at this from a future perspective. How do you think the proverbial attack landscape is going to start to change over the coming years in maritime?
The attack landscape is going to get worse. More and more people are going to realize what benefit they could get from maritime cybercrime. More and more tools are going to be developed that are specifically targeted at the sector. If you look at other parts of the space, there are tools that originally were only accessible by the NSA, and now you can buy for a couple of $100 on the dark web. Yep. So nowadays, fairly low-end criminals have capability that was nation-state level just a few years ago. I think what we're seeing is more and more tool sets are being developed for specific purposes. So maritime is going to be part of that mix. A quote I often like to use, remember when John Dillinger was asked, why did he rob banks? And the answer was because that's where the money is. I think what we're going to see is as it becomes clear, you just mentioned the amount of trade that's going by sea. I think sort of, the gross world product at the moment is something like $28 trillion. Well, a single incident in the maritime space has been shown to be able to affect 1% of global trade. That is a number with an awful lot of zeros on it.
Yep.
Monetizing all of that is not possible, but monetizing parts of it is possible. Also, of course, if you go into nation level capability and response in times of sort of stress and war, even more important. So what that means is people will be realizing that maritime is actually a high value target, if I can use that term, to both meanings of value. So I think we'll see more and more specialized, quote, equipment, unquote, dedicated towards the maritime sector, which means, of course, we'll have to see more and more mitigation appropriate to the maritime sector. So summing that up, I think the sector's had a bit of a respite that the rest of the world hasn't had because of the classic, we're out at sea, we're an island, we don't have to worry about this cyber and internet stuff. That period is over. There will now be a rapid escalation till maritime sector gets up to the level of banking or road transport or power or any of the other sectors. And then it'll be a level playing field for where attention will go. And the intelligent will say, yeah, maritime is still actually an interesting place for malicious activity. So it's also an interesting place for developing mitigations. Any new vessel being designed today that isn't being designed with cybersecurity in mind from the start is behind the curve. So we'll see this becoming more the norm in the industry, I think. We'll have the classic period of, the Wild West approach. I have a piece of kit, you should buy it off me, it'll solve your problems. I don't know what your problems are, but it'll solve them. We'll have a bit of that. But then we'll stabilize to the new norm will be a particular level of expertise, a particular level of policy, a particular level of process that will be appropriate to the sector and where it is. And it'll be a significant change, but then it'll become the new norm and the world will move on.
We really appreciate your time today, Professor, and your insights. And it's very unique, on the perspective that you guys have and what you do. Thank you for taking the time to join us and for providing this insight.
Very happy to.